Welcome back, Bio30 Prep. In this lecture, we're going to be studying the circulatory system. We're going to be studying the circulatory units, so the circulatory system and immunity. This particular lecture is on anatomy of the circulatory system. In your textbook, it's pages 268 to 276. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to identify the structures of the heart and circulatory system. You'll be able to describe the function of the heart and blood vessels. You'll be able to explain how substances such as nutrients and waste move between blood and the surrounding tissues. This is called capillary exchange. So first we'll talk about the importance of the circulatory system. Its main purpose is to provide nutrients to all the cells of the body. So it's the delivery system for glucose, oxygen, amino acids, all the raw components cells need to function properly. It also works as a communication system. It transports hormones to and from different parts of the body. If you remember your digestive system, things like secretin, CKK, gastrin, GIP, these hormones were released by either the stomach or the small intestine and would often trigger something to happen somewhere else in the body, like the pancreas, liver, or gallbladder. So this transport system allows hormones to travel from one organ to a different organ in the body in order to start some kind of chemical reaction. It also removes all the waste from all the cells. As cells do their metabolic processes, they produce waste. That waste has to be taken from those cells to our excretory system and taken out of the blood. But the blood takes that waste away from the cells. It also distributes heat. Cellular respiration, metabolic activities that cells do release heat, and as that heat's released, it enters the circulatory system, and then that heat can be carried out to our extremities, keeping us warm, but also keeping our internal body cooler than it would be if we weren't able to distribute that heat efficiently. It helps maintain body fluid levels, so water balance throughout the body. Some interesting statistics. If you took every single blood vessel in your body and laid it end to end, you'd end up with a line that's 96,000 kilometers long. And the reason it's so big, you don't think it's that big because when you think of blood vessels, you think of your arteries and your veins and things you can see, but there's a whole bunch of microscopic vessels. It turns out that every cell in your body is within 2 cell bodies of a blood vessel. So of those trillions of cells you have, every one of them is within 2 cell bodies of blood supply. Your heart pumps about 5 liters of blood between the heart and lungs every minute. So in 1 minute, your entire blood volume has been circulated throughout your body. Here's a picture of the heart. It's about the size of your fist. It beats between 70 to 200 times per minute, depending on an individual's level of health and activity. The heart is surrounded by a sac called the pericardium. It's a fluid-filled sac that reduces friction between the heart and surrounding membranes. Kind of the same idea as the pleural cavity or the pleural membranes. They provided a way or reduced friction between the lungs and the surrounding chest cavity. So same sort of idea. It consists of 4 chambers, 2 atria. These collect blood from all over the body. So there's the right atrium, and it collects blood from the vena cava. There's the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. It's not labeled, but you can see here down on the bottom left. And so this is a frontal view of the heart. This is looking at the heart as if you're looking at the front of a person. So the right atrium is actually on the left side of the diagram. The left atrium is collecting blood from the lungs. So as we can see, here's the other atrium. The 2 small chambers on the top of the heart are called atria. The 2 larger chambers are the ventricles, and these are the pumps. Notice that when you look at the atria, the walls of the atria are relatively thin. If you take a look at this wall here, it's relatively thin compared to the walls of the ventricle. The ventricle walls are very thick because they're full of muscle. This muscle has to pump the blood out to the body or out to the lungs. Here's some unlabeled diagrams of the heart. It's a good idea to print these off and get practice labeling all the parts. The parts you want to be able to label are the vessels. And when I say vessels, we're talking about the arteries. and veins that are connected to the heart. You want to be able to label valves, and these are between chambers or between a chamber and a vessel. You also want to be able to label the chambers themselves. And that's about it. We will be talking a bit about nervous structures or the nervous tissue in the heart, but that would usually be a separate diagram that you'd want to label. In terms of the structures you're responsible for knowing, this picture here shows you all of the labels that you should be able to put on your diagram. And I usually, when I'm labeling the heart, I start at the top left and just work my way down. Notice that many of the names are the same because they are similar structures. We have a superior vena cava and an inferior vena cava because they're both vena cava. One is coming from the head and the neck and the arms. The other one is coming up from the lower body, and they're dumping blood into the right atrium. So here we have the right atrium. Blood is then going to flow into the right ventricle. And so the right ventricle is labeled here, and then out into the left pulmonary artery. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart. That's how you know to use the artery name. And the left pulmonary arteries, and there's also right pulmonary arteries. One set goes out to the right lung, one set goes out to the left lung, but they all come from the pulmonary artery here, leaving the right ventricle. So the blood's going to go out to the lungs, pick up oxygen, and then come back to the heart. And as it comes back to the heart, it comes back through veins. And so the vein names are pretty simple too. There are left pulmonary veins, and there are right pulmonary veins. Both of those dump blood into the left atrium. So both of those sets of vessels dump blood into the left atrium. From there, it's going to go into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it goes through this valve here, and then up through the aorta. And once it gets to the aorta, blood's going to separate. Some is going to go to the head, to the arms, and then there's a channel that goes behind the heart that carries the blood to your lower body. So the other thing you should notice are the valves. There are atrioventricular valves, and there's two of them. They're between atrium, that's where the atrio comes from, and the ventricles. So there's one here, and then one here, over on the left side. And then again, the other set of valves we have to name are the semilunar valves. And again, there's two. The semilunar valves are between the ventricles and blood vessels, between arteries and ventricles. So there's semilunar valves, and there's two of them. There's the one that goes out to the aorta, and the one that goes to the pulmonary arteries. The other structure you should notice is the septum. And the septum is this band of tissue that divides the heart kind of in half. The blood in the right half of the heart never mixes with the blood in the left half of the heart because of this septum, the structure that separates the fluid from each other. So the deoxygenated blood, or the blood in the right atrium, is always separate from the blood in the left half of the heart. Similar picture, just showing the outside structures, or the outside of the structures. Same labels. This picture doesn't have anything new. It just shows you what it looks like on the outside. And one more view of the heart. This is still the outside of the heart, but it's the posterior view. This is viewing the heart from behind. So imagine if you could look into somebody's, if you're looking at the back of a person, and if you're able to see through their spine and ribs and all that kind of stuff, this is what you would see. And so notice that the left is actually on the left this time, because we've turned the heart around. And one thing that you should just notice is you can actually see a much clearer picture of where all those pulmonary veins are entering the left atrium. You also get a nice view of how the inferior vena cava joins up with the right atrium. So I just wanted to show this view just to show you how the veins actually enter the heart. This red vessel up here, this is the aorta. It's going to be carrying this wide part is actually going to have a blood vessel that goes down behind the entire heart and branches out and starts feeding your lower body with blood. The top three are for your arms and your head. The other thing we're going to see, these here, I didn't label them, but maybe I should have. These two tubes here, these blue tubes, these are pulmonary arteries. And they actually come from the right ventricle. So from the right ventricle, and you can see it better in an anterior view or from the front, but you'll see that there's a tube that goes along the front of the heart that connects to these two blood vessels here. So there's the back view of the heart. Mostly I just wanted you to see the relationship between the veins and the atria that they feed into. When we look at the blood vessels themselves, we'll notice some differences. Arteries, the vessels that always carry blood away from the heart, are thick. They're thick vessels, whereas veins are much thinner. The wall of the vein is much thinner than the wall of the artery. The other thing you're going to notice is that on the vein there are valves, so these little one-way gates that prevent blood from flowing backwards in the veins. So, blood always leaves the heart through the arteries. It can be either oxygenated or deoxygenated. Both leave through arteries. Blood returns to the heart through veins. And again, it can be deoxygenated blood or it can be oxygenated blood depending on where it's coming from. There's no visible connection between arteries and veins. And so for a long time, people didn't realize that the blood being pumped out through arteries was actually coming back to the heart through veins. Their connection is microscopic, and that connection is called capillaries. So here we have a branch of capillaries that connect an artery to a vein. And you notice in these set of arteries we're going from red to blue, and so this is actually the site of deoxygenation. That's where the oxygen is leaving the circulatory system and going into all the body cells that surround those capillaries. An aneurysm is a bulge in an arterial wall. What happens is, as the heart beats, there's pressure behind that fluid, behind that blood traveling through the circulatory system. If the pressure is too high, it'll actually start to wear away the lining of the artery. If the lining gets really thin, then the pressure causes a bulge in the artery. For those of you who've used sometimes your garden hose, after the garden hose has been around for a while, all of a sudden you'll see in one spot a little bubble in the casing of the garden hose. And it's the same idea. The casing has gotten thin, and the pressure of the water has pushed a little bubble into the side of that hose. Aneurysm is the same thing, only it's in a blood vessel. For arterial blood flow, again, it's always carrying blood away from the heart. They're high-pressure vessels, and that's why they're so thick to resist that pressure. There's three layers, an inner and outer layer of connective tissue. You can see that's the white here. There's connective tissue, and there's connective tissue. And in between is a layer of muscle and elastic connective tissue. And the idea is you want a really strong vessel or a really strong tube for carrying blood. The blood in arteries is high pressure. The heart's continually pushing on that blood, pushing it down the arteries. You want something that can move with that extra pressure and still get its shape back after the pressure's gone. So every time your heart beats, you can feel a pulse on your arteries, and it's actually the artery bulging under the extra pressure of that blood. As blood moves, it moves from the arteries to smaller arterioles, which are basically just narrower arteries. The diameter of an arteriole is controlled by the nervous system, so these arteries are surrounded by smooth muscle, or arterioles, by smooth muscle. Much the same way bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle, these are surrounded by smooth muscle as well, and they can actually contract or dilate in order to regulate blood pressure. And then as blood moves closer and closer to the cells it wants to deliver oxygen to, the arterioles break into capillaries. Now, blood flow in the capillaries is regulated by a precapillary sphincter. It's a muscle just like the pyloric sphincter in the digestive system. It's a circular muscle that can open and close an opening to that set of capillaries. It turns out that brain capillaries are almost always open, which is a good thing. Our brain needs lots and lots of oxygen to work properly. most of the other capillaries, only about 2% of the capillaries in the rest of your body are open at one time, depending on what you're doing. So most of you right now are probably sitting down, listening to this lecture, maybe falling asleep. A lot of the capillary beds in your legs and in your arms are going to be closed because the cells there aren't doing very much. They're just kind of sitting, relaxing, don't need to do a lot of cellular respiration, so no point supplying them with blood. If we look at the structure of capillaries, we can see, and this picture shows it really well, here's a capillary wall on one side of these red blood cells. Here's a capillary wall on the other side of these red blood cells, and we can see that the blood cells are traveling single file. In other words, capillaries are only wide enough to allow red blood cells to travel one at a time down the capillary vessel. The vessels themselves are only a single cell thick. You can't really see it in the picture very well, but if you imagine what they're talking about is this here is one cell, this here is one cell, and so on down the blood vessel wall. What this means is that substances can diffuse into and out of a capillary relatively easily because there's not much space to travel through. No cell is further than 2 cells away from a capillary, and what this allows for is the exchange of nutrients and waste and oxygen and carbon dioxide. Active cells, such as your muscle cells, are often supplied by more than one capillary bed, or more than one capillary. So, for example, if we just take a look at this kind of diagrammatic picture, this cell here is going to be getting oxygen and nutrients from this capillary, and oxygen and nutrients from this capillary. It's supplied by more than one because it's so close to both. They can be up to 1 millimeter long, but because they're so narrow, they're 1,000th of a millimeter thick. That's why they're microscopic, but they can be quite long. I mean, 1 millimeter is definitely something you can see, and for something that narrow, it's quite long. They're also easily damaged, allowing blood to enter those interstitial spaces or spaces between cells. This is what bruising is. When you bump your knee on a desk or on a chair, or bump your elbow and you get that kind of purple color, what you've done is you've broken capillaries and blood is leaked out into the surrounding tissue. Then the precapillary sphincters are going to close off, preventing any more blood from entering that area until the capillaries themselves have healed. So this shows a function of a capillary again. If we were to draw those single file red blood cells, my red blood cell doesn't look as good as the one on the last page, but it's still a red blood cell. So in these spaces are these red blood cells, single file, and what's happening is from the blood plasma, we're getting glucose and amino acids and water all being pushed out into the cells. So there's some space between the cells, tissue cells, and the capillary itself is called interstitial space, or it contains interstitial fluid. The body cells, oxygen is going to leave, so the oxygen on the red blood cells is going to go into the interstitial space, then into these body cells, allowing for cellular metabolism to take place. That's the deoxygenation, or the internal respiration, that we talked about in the respiratory system. In the alveoli, the opposite is true. The external respiration is going to happen, and the only difference for this picture is instead you'd see O2 going into the blood from an alveoli. All the nutrients are still flowing out because alveoli are composed of cells, which means they need water and glucose and amino acids. Also notice that water is being sucked back in to our blood vessels as well. Water gets pushed out and sucked back in order to maintain water balance. Again, things leaving the cells are going to be waste products like urea, and I guess here it would actually be ammonia that would get pushed out. In your liver, it will get converted into urea, but wastes are going to be pushed into your circulatory system, and also carbon dioxide, right? It's going to go into the fluid and turn into bicarbonate ions. And then it can go out to the lungs, and then it will be released out into your alveoli. So nutrients diffuse into cell tissues, waste diffuses into your circulatory system. Carbon dioxide is removed from the blood, the waste molecules are detoxified at the liver, and then filtered from the blood at the kidneys. Some protein and vitamin exchange also occurs at this level for cells. The blood is then collected into vessels called venules, and venules are really just small veins. Arterioles are small arteries, venules are small veins. The capillaries provide cells with oxygen, glucose, amino acids. They also exchange fluid between the blood and their surrounding extracellular tissues, extracellular fluid. Most fluid diffuses through capillary membranes, and that's what's going to carry the oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some water. Some ions, sorry. The fluid movement is regulated by two forces. Because our heart is beating, it's actually pushing on the blood, and as it pushes on the blood, the pressure in the capillaries is high enough that fluid actually gets pushed out into the surrounding space. So if the only force acting on our blood was blood pressure, all that fluid would leave our circulatory system, go out into our body cells, and we'd swell up like balloons. Luckily, some of that water is sucked back into our circulatory system by absorption, and this is done by osmosis. The osmotic pressure draws water back into our circulatory system, and what happens is there are large molecules inside each capillary, so large protein molecules that are not in the extracellular fluid. And so what's happening is high concentration of molecules inside a capillary, low concentration of molecules outside the capillary, and osmosis draws that water back into the capillary, trying to even the two concentrations out. Once blood gets into the veins, it's got to flow back to the heart. The problem is there's no more pressure pushing it. It's gone out to those capillaries, the pressure has dropped way down, and then if you can imagine two small rivers kind of joining together into a large one, the speed of the river slows down because now you have this great big wide river with not as much water in it compared to the other two. So something has to draw that blood back to the heart. So venules merge to form from capillaries, and the venules merge to become larger veins. The venules are lined with smooth muscle, not so much connective tissue, and the blood pressure is much lower in venules than it is in capillaries. It's too low to bring the blood back to the heart. So if we didn't have a system to bring it back, it would start to pool in venules and our limbs would start to swell. Blood flow back to the heart is regulated by one-way valves inside of the veins. So if you take a look, inside each of these veins are a series of one-way valves. As blood pushes through a valve, it opens it up. If the blood presses back against the valve, it forces the valve closed, preventing blood from draining any further back down the vein. So these one-way valves keep blood always moving up towards the heart. Blood gets squeezed through by skeletal muscles as we move around. As we contract these muscles, they push on the veins, narrowing them down, and then squirting the blood further up the vein. Veins contain about 50% of our total blood volume, which is half, considering the veins themselves take up less than half of our circulatory system. So they do store a lot of blood, and that blood can become available during times of stress. So from this lecture, you should get the idea that the circulatory system transports oxygen, nutrients, and hormones through our body. The heart consists of 4 chambers, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, and the flow of blood is guided by those one-way valves. There's 2 semilunar valves, 2 atrioventricular valves. You also want to be able to name all the vessels that are associated with the heart. So name the vessels, the valves, and the chambers associated with the heart. The arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart. Notice there's no mention of oxygenation in that statement. Anytime blood is moving away from the heart, it's doing so through an artery. Anytime it's moving towards the heart, it's doing so through a vein. Arteries are high-pressure vessels. As the blood pressure decreases, as blood travels away from the heart. So as blood spreads throughout your body, the pressure in the vessels that are carrying it drops. Veins are low-pressure vessels. They consist of one-way valves. The skeletal system and the muscular system aid in returning blood back to the heart.